Hey guys, tonight we drift back into old Japan to uncover what life was truly like for a geisha, along with a few other odd little corners of history worth wondering about along the way. Picture yourself born in Edo, the crowded, restless center of Japan, a place stuffed with tea houses, rice merchants, roaming monks, and no fewer than 4 people per block who are quietly convinced they used to be warlords in a past life. You arrive as a girl, which means your future has already been trimmed down to 3 thrilling possibilities. You can marry someone tedious, you can take vows as a nun and nurse a lifetime of quiet regret, or you can step into the okiya, the geisha house, and devote the next 20 years to serving tea to tipsy noblemen while telling yourself it is a form of freedom. You are 6 years old. You still find beetles endlessly interesting, and you have no notion that your parents have already settled the matter. You are to become a geisha. Not this very moment, of course. Today you are simply being led through the streets in your finest kimono, which itches and pinches in equal measure. Soon enough, though, your gentle little world of snacks and afternoon naps will be traded for a strict schooling in the art of swallowing your feelings. The okiya has the hush of a library that once married a temple and raised a child who grew up rather distant. The woman who answers the door is Okasan, the house mother, the sort of person who can size up your value by the way you bend at the waist. You attempt to smile. She offers none in return. Your parents bow low, exchange a handful of words, and depart, leaving you behind in what feels like an unusually courteous hostage handover. You have been formally passed along. You are not adopted here. You now count as property. But take heart, you will learn to curtsy your way through the ache of it. You have become a shikomi, which is an elegant term for a child who scours things. You will scrub floorboards, ready the baths, haul water, and now and then weep into your sleeve, in silence naturally. Your task is to observe the geisha, hold your tongue, and soak up everything by sheer proximity. You sleep in the corridor. You eat once everyone else has finished, and you already owe the house for the rice you just spilled. The geisha drift past you like creatures from another realm. Their hair is carved into shape, their footsteps make no sound, and their eyes seem to warn you against breathing too loudly. You are little more than a walking sponge in wooden clogs, yet you are watching and you are learning, and should your knees survive the ordeal, one day you too might sweep through a room without anyone ordering you to go fetch the towels. Your mornings begin before the sun and end only once your back gives out. You sweep tatami floors, coax charcoal fires to life, launder kimono fabric worth more than you dare imagine, and you fetch. Endlessly fetching, slippers, water, tea, more water, the good sandals, then the other good sandals. By midday you have covered more ground than a samurai marches in a season, and mercy upon you if you make a sound. A shikomi is to be silent, silent as an empty, creaking house. You speak only when addressed, and when addressed you answer promptly, though not so promptly that it reads as rude. You must never gaze straight at the senior geisha unless they happen to be looking your way, at which point you are suddenly looking far too much. Honestly, by this stage even blinking feels like a political decision. Nothing is taught to you outright. There is no schoolroom. Your whole education is watching, being shamed and repeating. You learn to fold an obi by studying someone. and yet, somehow, you begin to grasp how they cradle the fan just so, how laughter is measured out like the beat of a drum, how walking becomes a careful choreography of toes and timing. You come to see that being a geisha is not really about beauty at all. It is about precision, restraint, and the social instincts of a diplomat tiptoeing through a field of buried mines. Even so, you are still only a shikomi. You remain invisible until you are needed, and even then you stay mostly invisible, only now with a rag in your grip. The older girls may be gentle with you, if fortune smiles, or they may treat you as a living warning of what not to become. Either way, you keep your head lowered and your ears wide open, because here lies the secret. Every one of them began exactly here. Even the most graceful, impossibly composed geisha in the house once knelt on this very floor and was scolded for drying the chopsticks the wrong way. So you bear it quietly, and you wait for the day you can set down the mop and start to matter. Now that you have perfected the delicate craft of carrying tea while barely seeming to exist, it is time to broaden your abilities. Not dancing, and not music, so do not run ahead of yourself. First, you must master the discipline of sitting still for hours without twitching or drawing breath too eagerly. Welcome to posture training, that ancient and deeply honored Japanese practice of folding your knees into knots and stiffening your spine into bamboo. You kneel in Caesar, the formal seated position in which your legs tuck neatly beneath you, your back stays perfectly upright, and your circulation quietly surrenders. In the beginning, your legs go numb after 3 minutes. Then they start muttering threats. After 10, your entire lower half has legally declared rebellion. But you may not shift or stretch or cry out, because geisha are graceful. They do not squirm, they do not fidget. They absorb pain as though it were a matter of taste. You also start bowing without end. There are dozens of bows, each with its own quiet distinctions: a bow of greeting, a bow of thanks, a bow of apology, a bow that pleads not to be punished simply for existing. You learn to drop your head to precisely the correct angle, hold it for precisely the correct count, and rise with a smoothness usually reserved for rice paper unfurling in a breeze. And of course you will get it wrong. Everyone does. You will bow too quickly or too shallowly or, worst of all, brush the floor with your fingertips at the wrong angle. Someone will correct you with the soft ferocity of a disappointed ghost. You also learn how to sit during the tea ceremony. Your knees stay folded even as your spirit longs to flee your body. You must move as if underwater, slow, flowing, deliberate. Sneeze and congratulations, you have dishonored your ancestors. Yet somewhere amid the cramping and the silent screaming, something shifts. You begin to carry your head a little higher. Your movements grow quieter, more measured. You become less a child and more a shadow. This is the point where understanding dawns. Geisha training was never about spectacle. It is about control, over your voice, over your body, over the way the world perceives you. You are learning how to disappear beautifully. After years of scrubbing floors, torturing your knees, and cultivating the poise of a modest statue, you finally hear the words you have waited so long for. You are ready to become a maiko. It is rather like being informed you have been promoted from ghost to decorative human being. Congratulations, you are now a maiko, an apprentice geisha, which, fittingly, means the real suffering is only just getting started. First comes the hair. Your head is about to be turned into a living sculpture. Professional stylists appear bearing lacquer, wax, pins, and an unsettling air of calm. They coil your hair into the celebrated Nihongami style, a tall and intricate arrangement that takes hours to build and roughly one badly timed sneeze to ruin. And you can no longer sleep lying flat. No. You must use a takamakura, a wooden neck rest designed to keep your head raised so your precious hair touches nothing, least of all good sense. Sleeping this way is a trial of willpower and neck strength. You adjust to it, sort of, eventually perhaps. Then comes the wardrobe. Your new kimono is an embroidered monster, splendid, weighty, and evidently designed by someone with a grudge against shoulders. Its sleeves are long enough to sweep a small garden. The obi sash is knotted in an elaborate shape that rides halfway up your back and weighs about as much as a small child. Getting dressed each day demands help, often from 2 or 3 others who have committed to memory the ancient craft of winding fabric around a person until they are 3/4 kimono and 1/4 regret. Then there are the kanzashi, your hair ornaments, lovely, seasonal, and sharp enough to pass for light weaponry. You wear them like a crown, but they also announce your rank and your stage of training. One misplaced pin, and everyone in the room knows you have committed a fashion offense punishable by shame. As a maiko, your role is to watch, to imitate, and now and then to serve tea while dressed like a sentient cherry blossom. You may not speak too freely, laugh too loudly, or, heaven help you, ask questions. You are art, not commentary. Yet despite the discomfort, the aching scalp, and the impossibility of sneezing anywhere near an open flame, you sense something new. You are no longer invisible. People notice you now, and not merely because your outfit is visible from orbit. There is no single dazzling instant where you wake and think, yes, at last I am a proper apprentice geisha. It is more of a slow, ceremonial ascent wrapped in silk, incense, and a steady hum of stress. But the official day you debut as a maiko, that one is different. That day arrives heavy with ceremony and pressure. Think of it as the Edo period, equivalent of a debutante ball, except that in place of dancing and punch there is kneeling, sweating, and no fewer than 2 solid hours of styling with hot wax. You have trained for years, bowed more often than a temple statue, and memorized the elaborate way to pour tea without appearing to pour tea at all. Now, finally, you get to reveal your face, painted white of course, to the elite of Kyoto. And they are judging you politely, intently, quietly, from behind their folding fans. You wear your most magnificent kimono yet, layers of brilliant silk costing more than your birth family's entire home. It trails so far behind you that it drags like a very expensive regret. Your obi is tied in the durari style, a long dangling sash that all but announces, yes, I am new here, please admire my suffering. Your face is fully painted now, white rice powder from forehead to neck, red and black touches around the eyes, lips drawn into a flawless little bow, though only the lower lip at first, because apparently a rookie's elegance is a half-lip affair. You make your way through the streets in your ikobo, those platform sandals that moonlight as medieval instruments of torture, while everyone turns to look. Not because you are famous, but because you are a freshly minted maiko, and it is a rare thing to see. Also because you are moving very, very slowly. It is the only pace on offer. Then comes your misadashi, your formal debut. You meet clients for the first time, greet patrons, and perform for elders who can recall when their own necks still worked. Every step, every smile, every sip of tea is a test. And failure here is not met with shouting. It is met with disappointment, which is far worse. Yet somehow you make it through. You survive the ritual, the performance, the procession. You do not stumble, spill a thing, or offend a single dignitary. In geisha terms, this counts as an enormous triumph. And just like that, you are officially a maiko, half child, half porcelain icon, full-time work of performance. Life as a maiko carries no shortage of duties, pouring tea, dancing, pretending not to hear the occasional unsettling remark. But none of them rival your most sacred daily rite, the face. Your makeup routine has become a full military campaign. Step 1. Coat your face, neck and chest in a thick layer of white rice powder, which smells of chalk, clings like glue, and somehow works its way straight down into your soul. Step 2. Eyebrows. Your own are gone now, buried under a coat of powder, and fresh ones are sketched in with charcoal, thin, dark and grave, as though each brow is guarding a private secret. Step 3. The eyes. You trace the lids with a blend of red and black pigment, laid down by a brush so fine it might letter a grain of rice. A single tremble, and you've slid from graceful apprentice to hollow-eyed raccoon. Then come the lips. A junior maiko may colour only the lower one. The reason? Tradition, plus some hazy notion about modesty and not thinking too highly of yourself. You tint it red, shaping it into a small, neat bow. It is judged lovely. It also turns eating into an elaborate performance piece. There is no margin for error. Smear the lip and you begin again. Crooked line and you are refused. Eyeliner hasn't even been invented, so you make do with ground minerals mixed with saliva and quiet despair. When it's finished, you meet your reflection and find something at once ancient and unsettling. A doll. A pale, luminous, delicate doll carrying the muscle of a dancer and the daily rations of a squirrel. Yet here is the twist. Under the mask, your influence is growing. This face demands notice. It announces that you are tradition dressed as spectacle, and that yes, your fumbling with chopsticks has been observed. The paint is not vanity, it is armor. It sets you apart from everyday women. It signals that you have come to perform, not to mingle. It also informs your pores that their services are no longer required, so any fondness for breathing through the skin is best set aside. You do not put on this face for your own sake. You wear it so that others forget you are only 15 and begin to regard you as art. On first look, you might guess a geisha's finest instruments are her beauty, her kimono, or perhaps that sharp metal pin in her hair kept, of course, strictly for ornament. You would be mistaken. Her true weapons are two: the shamisen, and the venerable Japanese craft of making dull men feel captivating. You take up the shamisen, a three-stringed instrument shaped like a spatula pressed into military service and voiced like a mournful banjo. To play it asks for poise, timing, and fingers that refuse to seize up like salted squid. You practice hours each day, coaxing out sounds that start somewhere near a distressed cat and, over time, ripen into a passable mood. Your instructors show no mercy. One wrong note earns a sigh. 2 wrong notes earn a lifted eyebrow. 3 wrong notes and you are dispatched to tune the thing until it stops resembling a kitchen mishap. Music, though, is only half of it. The rest is conversation. You are not merely learning to speak. You are learning to speak around matters, to compliment without deceit, to hint without vowing, to hold a man's interest in talk while he never suspects you are quietly plotting tomorrow's dance steps behind your polite nods. You rehearse subtlety as though it were a fighting style. If a guest mentions his fortune, you soften into a smile and steer him toward the moon. If he pushes his flirting too far, you praise his choice in sandals and pour more sake. You reign as the sovereign of graceful deflection. And the poetry, oh the poetry. You commit hundreds of verses to memory, songs of blossoms, rivers and broken hearts. You can recite Basho while serving tea and still have wits to spare for noticing who has drunk a cup too many, all while your spine stays straight and your voice floats an octave above the screaming within. By now you have grasped that being a Maiko is not really about entertaining. It is about handling feeling, your own, your clients', the whole room's. You read a mood quicker than you read a page. You sense when to laugh, when to fall silent, and when to feign not having heard something dreadful. This is your new existence. Part musician, part counselor, wholly performance. And the alarming part is that you are becoming genuinely skilled at it. Ah yes, the dana. The word sounds refined, faintly mysterious, and just courteous enough to disguise its meaning. A moneyed male patron who backs your career with cords of obligation drawn so tight they could serve as a noose. You catch wind of the idea early. A dana, so they say, is an esteemed man who cherishes the arts, pays for your training, and covers the ruinous costs of kimono, hair ornaments, and mere survival. In exchange, you are meant to keep him company, make him feel significant, and ideally not sprint shrieking into the darkness. There is nothing romantic in it. This is no Jane Austen tale. This is a business deal draped in a silk robe. You do not select your dana. The house does. Your okia weighs his standing, his wealth, and his connections, the way a sommelier appraises well-aged insecurity. You, for your part, are instructed to smile and act as though the man across from you, 4 decades your elder and wheezing like a spent ox, is riveting. To be fair, not every dana expects certain favours. A few are sincere lovers of the arts who simply enjoy the company of a sharp, well-schooled woman who can talk poetry and politics without weeping or cutting in. Others are not. The lines are blurry, left unspoken by custom, and the weight of it all is enormous. You owe your house. You owe your future. You owe your knees, presently aching beneath yet another 10 pounds of cloth. And so you take up the craft of emotional balancing. You keep things gentle, cordial, respectful. You grow expert at making men feel adored while your soul stays locked safely behind the smile. If emotional labor could be taxed, you would ruin the shogunate. Now and then it turns out well. A dana might sponsor you for years, sparing you financial collapse and granting just enough space to make it bearable. Other times you acquire the lifelong knack of drifting away in real time while nodding through a story about grain taxes for the 15th time. Either way, the arrangement is not about love. It is about leverage. And the only means of surviving it is learning to tip the scales back toward yourself, all while wearing 3 layers of brocade and pretending the room is not ablaze. One day someone puts into your hands a pair of shoes resembling small wooden buildings and tells you to slip them on. They are called okobo, towering wooden platform sandals with no business existing. Built not for comfort but for ceremony, elegance, and possibly vengeance, these are worn only by Maiko, which means that once they are on your feet you are expected to drift, not walk, through the streets of Kyoto without wobbling, stumbling, or dissolving into tears. The okobo make you taller, statelier, less human. You no longer step like a person. You glide like a shrine procession. The aim is to move so gracefully that no one guesses you are wrestling for your life with every stride. They offer no cushioning, naturally. This is Edo period, Japan. Your feet throb, your calves cry out, your balance turns into a full-time occupation. Heaven help you if it rains. Slick Okobo on stone lanes turn every walk to a tea house into an Olympic-grade obstacle course. The noise they make, a crisp clop-clop, is intentional. When a Maiko passes down the street, everyone knows that rhythmic knock is her signature. It is beautiful. It is traditional. It also broadcasts your location to everyone within a 5-block stretch. Subtlety, apparently, is overrated. In time, your legs come around, more or less. You build muscles in your ankles you never knew were there. You learn to fall with dignity. You master rounding corners slowly, gracefully, with exactly the right measure of theatrical foot placement. And just as you believe you have it conquered, someone straps a 12-pound obi around your waist and sends you off to a client dinner up 3 flights of stairs. Wearing Okobo is a rite of passage. It is also a public notice that you remain an apprentice. Full geisha wear flatter shoes, because by then they have earned the right not to suffer quite so visibly. You are still earning it, one careful step at a time. Let us settle something. A geisha is an entertainer. You perform. You dance. You sing. You pour sake with an elegance and a flirtation so faint it could pass for the weather. You are a living work of art whose strength lies in restraint. You say just enough. You reveal just enough. You dwell in the sacred space between admiration and distance. A courtesan, an uiran, is a high-ranking companion trained in the art of pleasure. Her role carries layers of performance too, but with one clear distinction. Hers usually concludes in a bedroom. Yours concludes with applause, a bow, and sore feet. The visual muddle does not help. Both wear elaborate kimono. Both wear ornate coiffures. But here is your cheat sheet. If the obi is knotted in front, she is a courtesan. Quick access. If it is knotted behind, she is a geisha. Slow exit. You are welcome. None of that helps, though, in a room full of men who watched one bad film and take geisha to mean an exotic invitation. So you cultivate a talent, the art of politely correcting someone while leaving them feeling they have taught you something. It is linguistic aikido. You offer lines like, "How kind of you to be curious. Our traditions are really quite different from that. Smile, sip, redirect, repeat. You will deliver this same explanation 100 times across your career. It will never stop being needed. Yet each time you do it with grace, you draw the boundary again, one smooth sentence at a time. Because being a geisha means never losing your composure, even when someone mistakes you for something you are not. Once more, as a Maiko and in time a geisha, you are expected to master music, dance, etiquette, and the fine skill of appearing thrilled while a man discusses rice tariffs for 2 hours. But your most useful and least taught skill is saying no without ever uttering the word no. You cannot simply refuse someone outright. That would be rude and, worse, graceless. No one pays a geisha to be blunt. Your worth rests in subtlety, in suggestion, in the ability to pivot away from a proposition like a butterfly in getter sandals. Say a client grows bold. Perhaps he leans a touch too close, praises your eyes a touch too often, or offers the old chestnut. Perhaps we might meet somewhere more private. You do not slap him. You do not shout. That is amateur hour. Instead, you smile, tip your head, and say something like, "You must be very popular with women." The sentence holds precisely no substance, yet it flatters him, reroutes the talk, and buys you 10 seconds to refill his cup and pretend it never happened. Another favorite. "Oh, what a pity. I'm dreadfully busy that day. This holds up even when he has named no day. You are forever dreadfully busy, since a geisha's calendar is a mystery folded in silk and plausible deniability. Or you reach for the reliable classic, laughter. Just a soft, amused chuckle, then a gentle shake of the head and a new subject. It is a dance, one where you lead and they never quite notice. With time, you grow fluent in the tongue of deflection. You can turn someone down 3 times running while leaving them feeling like the guest of honor. It is draining, true, but it is an art form, one handed down from woman to woman like a secret grimoire written in fan gestures and passive-aggressive grace. Because here is the truth. A geisha's work is not to feed desire. It is to manage it, to guide it, to make the room feel enchanted while keeping both hands on the wheel. And if all else fails, smile, bow, and say, "What an interesting thought." That usually does the trick. After years of kneeling, bowing, smiling, and swallowing the urge to scream into your obi, the day finally arrives. You are no longer a maiko. You have become a geisha. The change is quiet. There is no parade, no burst of congratulatory fireworks. You simply wake one morning and, rather than being the girl still learning, you find that you are the very benchmark everyone else is straining to reach. And oddly enough, your knees ache as much as ever. Your wardrobe shifts as well. Gone are the brightly colored, long-sleeved maiko kimono that once made you resemble a walking bouquet. The new look is softer, more restrained, more refined, as though you have earned the right to dress like a woman who holds opinions. And your hair, mercifully, is no longer a weekly sculpture built from wax and sheer stubbornness. Now you wear a wig. Yes, an actual wig. It weighs more than your head and still demands half a salon and a small miracle to arrange, but at least you can rest again the way ordinary people do, which is to say, fitfully and on a futon. The greater change, though, is that you now perform on your own. You no longer trail behind others. You lead. You are expected to host, to entertain, to charm without any help beside you. Your shamisen solos stretch longer. Your conversation grows sharper. You must stay composed, graceful, and, above all, in command. Clients no longer regard you as merely charming. They see you as formidable, not in any castle-burning, sword-swinging sense, but in the way that a single lifted eyebrow can quietly unravel an entire conversation. You have refined subtlety into a tool. You have turned grace into something with an edge. People pay attention when you speak, or rather, when you decide to speak, because a geisha understands the real secret of power, which is silence used with care. And this new standing brings new burdens. You must guide the younger maiko. You must smile again at clients you have already smiled at 1,000 times over. You carry the weight of legacy, of expectation, of thousands of years of cultural performance. Yet somewhere within, something has quietly shifted. You are no longer pretending. You have grown into the person the Okiya shaped you to be, not simply a woman in a kimono, but a living emblem of refinement, mystery, and finely measured emotional labor. You are no longer training toward the tradition. You are the tradition. So, you have survived. You have danced, poured tea, smiled through centuries of custom, and kept from stumbling in your okobo long enough to reach the unspoken chapter that closes every geisha's story. And then what? Geisha do not truly retire, at least not in the ordinary sense. There is no ceremony where someone presents you with a golden fan and a note of thanks. There is no pension. You simply drift out of the spotlight bit by bit, like a candle that has burned down to nothing. Some geisha turn to teaching. You become the one who corrects a student's bow with a single glance. You demonstrate the shamisen for the 100th time, fully aware that the maiko in front of you is thinking about lunch. You have become the legacy itself, living proof that grace grows old with dignity and outlasts every passing fashion. Others take on the role of housemother, the okaya-san. Yes, her. The very woman who once studied your bow as though it were a crime is now you, standing beside the sliding door, examining the newest shikomi with the look of someone wondering whether the rice pot has begun to burn. You run the household, you set the rules. You decide who rises and who sweeps the entryway yet again, until they finally learn to walk without sounding like a stampede. Some geisha marry, quietly and shrewdly, perhaps even to a former patron who is still living and possesses the good manners never to ask what anything costs. You simply trade one kind of performance for another, mastering the art of smiling through domestic life. But many geisha carry on much as before, slower, quieter, yet no less sharp. You host smaller, more intimate gatherings. You become less about display and more about presence. You say less, but each word carries further. A single nod from you can change the mood of a room. Your absence begins to be felt. There is no grand departure, no final bow before the curtain. You merely slip into the shadows, still wrapped in silk, still moving like a poem with ankles. And even as your public appearances grow scarce, your name endures, carried forward by younger geisha who still practice the gestures you perfected so long ago. By now your knees have taken the permanent shape of tatami mats. Your spine straightens by reflex. Your voice, always musical, holds authority, not because it is loud, but because it so rarely needs to be. You are no longer merely a geisha. You are memory made visible. You will not find your name cut into stone or set down in textbooks. You will never trend. There is no viral clip of you pouring tea with surgical precision or reciting waka poetry between shamisen chords. But your legacy is not the kind that requires volume. It survives in the next girl, kneeling too long on aching legs, trying not to smudge her lip paint as she perfects a half smile that conceals exhaustion while radiating charm. It survives in the way the fan opens, crisp, exact, and soundless, a gesture older than most empires. It survives in the hushed pauses between words at a gathering, where your presence still alters the air, even if no one recalls the date of your debut or the name of the client who bought your first seasonal comb. Your task was never to be loud. It was to be unforgettable in ways most people could never quite explain, to captivate rather than seduce, to suggest rather than declare, to turn a dinner into a ceremony and a single glance into a statement. And through all of it, you endured. You endured the training, the burden of tradition, the shoes that seemed determined to end you. You endured the assumptions, the rivalry, the clients who mistook performance for permission, and the rumors that never faded quite as quickly as they were invented. Above everything, you endured with elegance in a world that demanded both perfection and silence. You made room for self-possession. You shaped a life that was at once performance and quiet resistance, all without ever raising your voice. And perhaps no one will speak your name aloud when they tell the story of Kyoto. But someone will pour tea in just that way. Someone will move in a kimono without a single rustle. Someone will smile with an unreadable gaze and say precisely enough and nothing more. And in that moment you will still be there, not as a ghost, but as legacy. Forget candlelit dinners and moonlit serenades. In ancient Sumer, the cradle of civilization, marriage had far less to do with romance than with keeping careful records. Love was optional. Contracts were not. The Sumerians, who lived more than 4,000 years ago in what is now southern Iraq, were the earliest people we know of to formalize marriage through written agreements. And by written, we mean pressed into wet clay with a stylus. These were never declarations of undying devotion. They were binding economic arrangements. A cuneiform tablet would often spell out precisely what each side brought to the union, and no, unconditional love never appeared on the list of assets. The bride arrived with a dowry, which might include livestock, textiles, servants, or land. The groom's family could add a bride price, less a warm gesture of goodwill than something closer to a deposit. If the marriage collapsed, the tablet laid out plainly what was forfeited, refunded, or reclaimed. Yes, Sumerian marriages came with early versions of prenups, and your love life could quite literally be audited. But the Sumerians did not treat marriage as a purely cold transaction. It was also a foundation for preserving social order. Women were expected to be faithful and to bear children. Men were expected to provide and protect, or at the very least to avoid embarrassing the family during public rituals. Infidelity, especially on the part of the wife, could be punished severely, sometimes with death by drowning. Divorce was permitted, but only when just cause could be proven. Something as vague as growing apart would never have been enough. The weddings themselves were modest occasions, with no elaborate decor and no white veils. The couple would move in together and carry out certain rituals, perhaps invoking deities such as Inanna or Enlil. But the true marriage began once the community acknowledged the union and the contract was filed away like an ancient tax return. To the Sumerians, marriage was less a personal journey than a civic duty. Your union became one small gear in the vast machinery of inheritance, agriculture, and divine order. And your spouse was a partner in social strategy, a teammate in a world where surviving floods and feeding goats mattered far more than candlelit poetry. In ancient Egypt, marriage was not merely approved by society, it was reflected in the heavens themselves. The gods were married too. Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. Even chaos had its match. The Egyptians believed that divine couples held the cosmos in balance, and human marriages were expected to do much the same, which was a considerable amount of pressure for a couple simply trying to keep the household cats away from the sacred grain. Marriage was regarded as the ideal social condition. A man was expected to marry young, ideally before he could cause too much trouble as a bachelor. Women married in their early teens, and while love may not have been the central concern, companionship and affection were genuinely prized. Egyptian love poetry was surprisingly tender. One poem confesses that the writer's heart flutters in haste at the mere thought of the beloved. Another declares that she has stolen his heart with her hair. Not quite the language of modern dating profiles, but touching all the same. Legal documents were often part of the process, particularly among the upper class. Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians relied on contracts with clear terms regarding property, dowries, and the conditions of divorce. Yet, unlike in Sumer, Egyptian women held notable legal rights. They could own property, begin divorce proceedings themselves, and sue their husbands for neglect. Queen or commoner, an Egyptian woman could haul her husband into court if he failed to provide bread, beer, or, crucially, oil. Marriage between close relatives was another curiosity, especially among the royals. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters. And no, this was not a matter of too few available partners. The point was to imitate the gods themselves. In the same way that Isis had wed her brother Osiris, a marriage joining brother and sister among royalty was thought to keep sacred bloodlines intact, divine heredity passed down, though it carried a measure of biological hazard alongside it. The ceremonies were not grand occasions. No priest offered a blessing, and no crowd gathered to watch. A pair counted as married the moment they began living together under one roof. Nothing more. No doves, no cake, and no tossed flowers. The gods asked for no ceremony to give their blessing. What mattered most in marriage was children. Not affection, not companionship, not personal happiness, only heirs. The greater the number, the better. Should a wife prove unable to bear a child, a man might take a concubine or wed a second woman. Affection was optional. Descent was the whole point. Across most of the ancient world, marriage was a matter for the family. In Sparta, it was closer to a military exercise. If a Sumerian marriage was a transaction and an Egyptian one an imitation of the divine, then a Spartan marriage was survival, dressed up in state messaging and hard muscle. It went something like this. Spartan boys were removed from their homes at the age of 7 and thrown into the agoge, the harsh training program built to forge elite soldiers who could kill with the simplest object and swallow raw roots without a grimace. The girls trained as well, in wrestling, in throwing the javelin, and in sharp-tongued remarks. The aim was not strength for its own sake. It was about bringing healthy children into the world. A frail child was a burden. A sturdy one was a Spartan in the making. So marriage had nothing to do with candlelight or finding the right person. It was breeding directed by the state. Officials even fixed the proper age for it, roughly 30 for men and the early teens for women. Hardly romantic. The wedding rite was as peculiar as one might expect from a people who believed iron rods made suitable money. It unfolded like this. The bride had her head shaved and was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, then left by herself in a darkened room. The groom would slip in during the night and slip away again before dawn, back to his all-male barracks. Even once married, Spartan men did not share a home with their wives. The bond rested on secrecy and brief meetings, a kind of ancient courtship with a curfew attached. Why all the stealth? The notion was to keep longing alive. Too much closeness might soften a man, and softness had no home in Sparta. Mystery, so the reasoning went, kept the feeling burning, though a modern counsellor might raise an eyebrow. For all these odd customs, Spartan women held more power than nearly all of their ancient peers. They could own land, manage estates, and mock men openly without fear of death. Love poetry found little favour, but cleverness did. Spartan women were known for their sharp tongues. One instructed her husband to come home with his shield or upon it, which was more or less the ancient Greek way of saying, "Do not shame me." In ancient India, marriage was far more than a private joining. It was a sacred obligation, a spiritual passage guided by Dharma, the cosmic law. Grounded in the Vedic tradition, marriage counted as one of the essential rites of passage, the samskara, needed to carry out one's duties toward family, ancestors, and society. It was never undertaken casually. It was not just an agreement between two people, but a tie between two families, two lines of descent, and at times two whole villages. Its purpose was to uphold Varna Dharma, the social and moral order, keeping things stable through caste alignment, correct ritual, and shared obligation. Arranged marriages were the rule, and horoscopes were central to pairing partners. Astrologers studied how the stars and planets lined up to judge compatibility. The thinking was that harmony in the heavens would bring peace on earth. A fitting match was believed to bring prosperity not only to the couple but to the entire household. The wedding itself was an intricate symbolic rite built around Agni, the sacred fire. The couple walked 7 steps, the Saptapadi, around the flame, speaking a vow at each one, to nourish each other, to grow strong together, to share their wealth, to live righteously, to raise capable children, to enjoy the seasons of life side by side, and to remain companions for life. With these steps taken, the two were held to be spiritually joined. The wife, known as the Sridharma Patni, was expected to be both a partner and a moral guide. She ran the household, carried out religious duties, and stood at the heart of preserving the family's ritual purity. Her sphere was domestic, yet it was regarded as spiritually essential. The husband was to protect, to provide, and to uphold Dharma through his own behavior. Polygamy existed, particularly among the elite, but monogamy was seen as the ideal. Widows were expected to live plainly, though customs shifted across time and region. The disputed practice of sati, in which a widow burned herself on her husband's pyre, was uncommon in early times and arose much later, largely apart from Vedic ideals. In ancient China, marriage was no private matter. It was a tightly ordered institution grounded in Confucian teaching, the worship of ancestors, and the hierarchy of the family. To marry was not simply to fall in love or to start a family. It was to honor what had come before, and to safeguard what would follow, all beneath the constant gaze of the living and the dead alike. The chief aim of marriage was carrying on the family line. Filial piety, Shao, required that a son marry and produce male heirs to keep the ancestral rites going. Should a man fail in this, he not only let his parents down, but risked breaking the family's spiritual duties. The ancestors had to be fed and honored. A home without children was a snapped link in the lineage, a source of shame and of cosmic disorder. The choice of marriage was never left to the young couple. Families hired matchmakers who worked out the terms, looked into backgrounds, and consulted astrological charts. A marriage lacking the right heavenly alignment was thought to be a gamble. Compatibility had nothing to do with chemistry, and everything to do with heavenly timing and earthly duty. The 6 rites of a traditional Chinese marriage mirrored this ceremonial detail. It opened with a proposal, then an exchange of names, divination, betrothal gifts, the setting of a date, and at last the ceremony itself. Every step carried its own rituals, symbols, and careful exchange between the families, a process that might stretch over months or even years. On the wedding day, the bride wore red, the colour of joy and good fortune, and rode in a decorated sedan chair to the groom's home. She was veiled, silent, and ceremonially still. Once she arrived, the couple bowed 3 times, to heaven and earth, to the parents, and finally to one another. Those bows marked the order of loyalty. The cosmos first, then family, then self. After the marriage, the wife joined her husband's household and was expected to obey his parents as though they were her own. Her role was to bear sons, run the domestic affairs, and serve without complaint. Some women earned respect with age or with motherhood, yet their standing stayed within a plainly drawn patriarchal order. Divorce was rare and shameful. A man could put his wife aside for disobedience or for barrenness, but a woman held no such right. The marriage tie, however honored, was uneven in its power. In ancient Japan, marriage was shaped not by a central legal code or by religious doctrine, but by centuries of shifting custom, regional practice, and a deep respect for nature and ancestors. Grounded in Shinto belief, the native spirituality of Japan, marriage was less about formal contracts than about purity, harmony, and social cohesion. Shinto holds that kami, divine spirits, dwell within all things, in rivers, trees, mountains, and even people. A harmonious marriage, then, was seen as bringing oneself into line with the natural order. Purity and ritual cleanliness mattered in every major rite of passage, and marriage was no exception. In the earliest periods, families arranged marriages rather than the partners themselves. The aims were practical: forging alliances, consolidating land, and continuing the household line, especially among elite families. Yet compared with neighboring cultures, Japan granted women a relatively higher standing. In ancient times, women could inherit property, manage estates, and hold sway within the household. The usual marriage followed a pattern called mukwairi, the groom entering the bride's household. In this custom, the groom moved into the home of the bride's family, a reversal of the more common patriarchal traditions found elsewhere in Asia. This reflected the weight given to matrilineal continuity in some regions, particularly among powerful families. In time, though, this gave way to yomiri, in which the bride joined the groom's household, a change that fell in step with growing patriarchal norms. Shinto wedding rites centered on purification and reverence. The couple took part in a sansan kudo ceremony, sipping sake 3 times from 3 cups. Each sip stood for a bond between the two individuals, between their families, and between their spirits. There were no vows in the Western sense, but the symbolism spoke of unity and mutual respect. Unlike the rigid legal systems of other cultures, early Japanese marriage customs were flexible. Polygamy was practiced among the elite, but never made a formal institution. Divorce, though discouraged, remained possible, especially where there was infertility or incompatibility. Still, public harmony and family honor always came first, and any separation had to be managed with discretion. In ancient Rome, marriage was not merely a personal milestone. It was a civic institution bound up with law, class, and public duty. Romans saw marriage as a mirror of the social order, a place where alliances were struck, property changed hands, and lineage was preserved beneath the watchful eye of the state and the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. Roman marriage came in different legal forms. The most traditional was cum manu, in which the wife left her own family and passed under the legal authority, the manus, of her husband or his father. She was no longer legally part of her birth family and became something like a daughter within her husband's house. Her property became his. This form gradually faded, though, in favour of sine manu, in which the wife stayed under her father's authority and kept greater legal independence. That shift reflected changing attitudes and the growing economic clout of elite Roman women. The ceremonies were marked by ritual and symbol. The bride wore a flame-coloured veil called the flammeum, and her hair was parted into 6 locks with a spear, a nod to tradition and to the martial roots of Roman culture. The joining of hands, the dextrorum iunctio, stood for the union, and offerings were made to the household gods, above all to Juno, the goddess of marriage. A formal procession led the bride to her new home, where she was greeted with fire and water, emblems of purity and life. For the Roman elite, marriage was a political instrument. Senators and nobles used marriages to seal alliances and secure influence. Personal affection, while not beside the point, often came second. Even emperors arranged marriages for political advantage, frequently setting their own wishes aside. Women in Roman marriages were expected to be modest, loyal, and devoted to running the household. And yet Roman women, especially under sine manu marriages, could own property, inherit wealth, and even begin a divorce. Divorce was common and socially accepted so long as it was handled with dignity. "Where you are," the bride would once vow, "I am." But when things went sour, parting could be as quick as stating one's intent before witnesses. For the ancient Hebrews, marriage was not simply a social contract, it was a sacred covenant shaped by divine law. Rooted in the traditions of the Hebrew Bible, marriage stood as a cornerstone of religious life, of lineage, and of moral order. It was a relationship that mirrored not only human connection, but also the lasting bond between the people of Israel and their God. Marriage was seen as essential to carrying out the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It was expected of every man, and early marriage was the norm. Love, though valued, was not the foundation. Obedience to God and duty to family came first. A proper marriage kept tribal identity intact, secured rights of inheritance, and maintained the purity of the community. Arranged marriages were standard, worked out between families with an eye to kinship ties, reputation, and property. A bride price known as the mohar passed from the groom to the family of the bride, understood not as a transaction of ownership, but as a solemn token of intent and recompense. It was common for young women to wed in their early teenage years, whereas men tended to be somewhat older, having first secured the resources needed to maintain a household. These were homebound occasions, frequently held under the roof of the bride's family and rounded off with a joyful banquet. The observances leaned toward gladness, the carrying forward of lineage, and blessings offered through wine, song, and the recitation of Holy Scripture. A written agreement, the ketubah, laid down what the husband owed his wife, namely sustenance, garments, and marital companionship. That same document safeguarded her financial standing should divorce or the death of her husband ever occur. Even though patriarchy shaped so much of Hebrew life, a woman occupied a place of dignity inside the family, and the woman of valor praised in Proverbs was portrayed as prudent, diligent, and held in high regard. Polygamy did exist, seen most clearly among the earliest patriarchs such as Abraham and Jacob. Yet as the centuries passed, monogamy grew to be the norm, especially in the years following the exile in Babylon. Ending a marriage was allowed, though frowned upon. A husband could grant a get, a certificate of divorce, provided certain circumstances were met. Even so, that step demanded religious sanction and fell under legal restraints designed to keep the woman from being left exposed or shamed. Among the ancient Celts, marriage was a profoundly shared and symbolic act, threaded through the cycles of the natural world, loyalty to the tribe, and the law of the ancestors. It functioned less as a fixed institution and more as a flexible changing bond, molded by individual choice, communal obligation, and the rites of the seasons. In contrast to the strict statutes of Rome or the cosmic duties of India, the marriage customs of the Celts differed greatly from one tribe and territory to the next, from Ireland to Gaul to the Scottish Highlands. Still, certain shared strands held fast, namely partnership, fertility, and honour. To the Celts, marriage stood as a sacred vow, commonly pledged before the elders of the tribe, the Druids, and the ever-present gods of earth and sky. A union might be monogamous or polygynous, depending upon a person's wealth and rank. Among the nobility and the chieftains, a man having several wives was hardly unusual, each of them keeping her own household standing. Yet this arrangement was steered by plain expectations and shared consent. Women were far from passive figures. Celtic women frequently held legal rights, among them the ownership of property, the freedom to divorce, and even the power to propose marriage themselves. One remarkable aspect of the Celtic union was the trial marriage, an arrangement lasting a year and a day in which a couple might share a life together before choosing whether to make the relationship lasting. Should either person feel unhappy, they were free to part without any shame attached. This practice, remarkably progressive for its era, placed consent and compatibility above permanence pursued for its own sake. Wedding rites often lined up with the festivals of the seasons, such as Beltane, a fire ceremony that heralded the arrival of summer and fertility. Couples might spring over the flames or walk between bonfires as a sign of cleansing and joining. Such rites were thought to bestow upon the marriage strength, abundance, and accord with the natural world. Marriage contracts, particularly among the elite, were made formal and could carry provisions concerning dowries, jointly held property, and inheritance. Unlike so many ancient peoples, Celtic law acknowledged obligations that ran both ways between husband and wife. Mistreatment or neglect could serve as grounds for ending the bond, and women could seek redress in the courts of the tribe. The spiritual side of Celtic marriage was never far off. Vows reached beyond the personal, tied instead to the land, the tribe, and the gods. The joining of a couple formed one thread within the wider weave of territory and bloodline, and their faithfulness stood as a pledge not only to one another, but to the sacred equilibrium that held the world in place. The beginnings of Malbork Castle rest not in the fog-laden woods of Poland, but in the scorching warmth of the Holy Land. Late in the 12th century, the Teutonic Order came into being amid the turmoil of the Third Crusade. First established in 1190 as a band of German crusaders tending to injured Christian fighters at Acre, the order before long grew into a fully realized military and monastic body, part caregiver, part warrior, and entirely committed to the spread of Christendom. But the Holy Land was gradually being lost. As the Muslim forces under Saladin recovered their lands and the powers of Europe drifted toward indifference, the Teutonic Knights discovered they lacked any clear calling. Their fervour endured, yet the arena of their struggle was about to move. In 1226, the Polish Duke, Conrad of Masovia, recognized a chance. Beset by incursions from the pagan Prussian tribes to his north, he called the knights into his domain, holding out territory in return for defence and the conversion of the Baltic peoples. The Teutonic Knights accepted, though their aspirations reached well beyond missionary labour. Armed with papal support and imperial approval, they set about carving out a theocratic state of their own. Along this war-scarred frontier, the sword would carry the cross. One brick after another, they set down the base of a fresh stronghold to secure their authority. Marienburg, later called Malbork, Mary's Castle, named in tribute to the Virgin Mary, patroness of the order. Work began in 1274, and from the very outset it was intended to loom large. This was no mere fortress, it was a proclamation. Raised in the distinctive red Gothic brickwork of northern Europe, it climbed above the banks of the Nogat River like a crusader's vision rendered in stone. Its walls meant not simply to bar pagans and rebels, but to announce the spiritual and military strength of the knights across the whole region. Malbork amounted to far more than a castle. It was a headquarters, a monastery, a seat of administration, and the symbolic core of a rising religious empire. The warrior monks were foreign guests no longer. They were rulers now, and this castle, still in its earliest days, would in time become the largest fortress on earth by land area and a stronghold of medieval power that lasts to this day. By the closing years of the 13th century, Malbork Castle had grown past a mere strategic foothold. It was becoming a monumental expression of power, faith, and architectural aspiration. Rising from the level plains of the Vistula Delta, It stood defiant and impossible to mistake, a fortress raised not from stone but from brick, the bold material of the north. In a time when most castles held to limestone and granite, Malbork's red Gothic walls gave off both invention and menace. The Teutonic knights sought more than a stronghold. They wanted a sacred fortress where warfare and worship could dwell together. The design mirrored this double nature. The complex took shape in three parts: the high castle, the middle castle, and the lower castle, each of them walled and fortified, each set to its own purpose. The high castle, the spiritual heart, held the chapel, the chapter house, and the quarters of the monks. This was the place where the knights dwelled, prayed, and made their plans. The architecture was shaped with religious meaning in view. Slender windows admitted a filtered light that cast long shadows across the cold stone floors. Vaulted ceilings soared like the arches of a cathedral. Features built for defense served at the same time as spiritual figures. Height signified nearness to God. Darkness set against light stood for divine truth, opposing the disorder beyond the walls. Malbork was fashioned not merely to withstand a siege, it was fashioned to stir awe. The Church of the Holy Virgin, set within the high castle, boasted stained glass, elaborate tilework, and a figure of the Virgin Mary that rose above the outer walls. Every turret, corridor, and tower was arranged with purpose. Nothing was squandered, nothing left to chance. Even the latrines emptied cleverly into the Nogget River, a sign that the knights carried order and cleanliness into a land they regarded as untamed and unconverted. As the 14th century opened, Malbork went on expanding. Craftsmen, labourers, and stonemasons toiled the year round. Local peasants were often pressed into service to furnish food, timber, and labour. All the while, the fortress grew into the administrative and spiritual centre of the Teutonic Order's swelling state. Something greater than a castle, Malbork was a statement, a sermon of brick and mortar declaring that the order had come to stay, as warriors and as monks alike. It was faith dressed in armour, a monastery girded with battlements, and it had scarcely begun to grow. As the 14th century wore on, Malbork Castle was no longer merely a military base. It had turned into the very centre of a widening theocratic empire. From this imposing brick bastion, the Teutonic knights stretched their command across the Baltic, changing what had once been a campaign of conversion into an outright colonization of land, people, and resources. The order ran like something between a kingdom and a corporation. Its Grand Master, in effect both Pope and King within the realm, governed from Malbork with the help of a rigid monastic hierarchy. Below him stood knights, priests, and lay brothers, all held to vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and yet overseeing sprawling estates, trade routes, and systems of taxation. Their aim was not religious alone. It was the consolidation of territory. Forests were felled, towns were razed, and paganism was pushed underground or wiped out. Malbork served as the symbolic and the logistical heart of the whole undertaking. Here the chapter house gathered to weigh policy, to elect new Grand Masters, and to settle questions of war and diplomacy. The castle's fortified treasury kept safe its gold, silver, and relics, gathered through tithes, trade, or conquest. Its armies furnished swords and armour for fresh crusades into Lithuania and beyond. As its sway increased, the order cast itself as a civilizing force. Roads and bridges went up. Trade thrived along the Vistula River. German settlers were urged to move in, founding towns with Gothic cathedrals and markets patterned on the Holy Roman Empire. The region came to be known not for its pagan past, but for its rigid order beneath the strict rule of the Black Cross. But power brought enemies along with it. Poland and Lithuania, still largely pagan and fiercely their own, pushed back against the Order's expansion. While some accepted conversion willingly, others resisted bitterly against forced baptism and foreign rule. The borderlands turned into battlegrounds. Raids came often. Tensions smouldered. Even so, from behind Malbork's thick walls, the Teutonic Knights appeared unbeatable. At its peak, the Teutonic Order held wide expanses of land reaching from the Baltic Sea far into Eastern Europe. And at the very heart of it stood Malbork, a castle no longer but the capital of a religious state, a monument to faith, power, and imperial ambition. Yet ambition seldom passes unchallenged. By the opening of the 15th century, the seemingly unstoppable ascent of the Teutonic Order had started to stir dangerous resentment. From its brick towers and iron gates, Malbork Castle watched over a realm shaped by conquest and upheld through faith. But the knights had made formidable enemies, chief among them the newly joined kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. In 1386, a momentous shift took place. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, embraced Christianity and married the Polish Queen, becoming King Władysław II Jagiello of Poland. Through this union, Lithuania, the final pagan bastion in Europe, took up Christianity, stripping away the Order's central justification for its crusade. The ideological ground beneath the Teutonic Knights began to give way. Yet, it was not solely a matter of religion. It concerned land, influence, and revenge as well. Lithuania had long withstood the Order's invasions. Poland carried territorial grievances. Now bound together by marriage, faith, and politics, the two kingdoms possessed the might to face the Knights head-on. Tensions hardened into border raids. Raids swelled into war. The reckoning could not be avoided. In 1410 it arrived. The Battle of Grunwald, also called the Battle of Tannenberg, brought the combined Polish-Lithuanian army against the Teutonic Knights in one of the largest and most brutal battles of medieval Europe. The knights, heavily armoured and self-assured, were outmanoeuvred. Their army was shattered. Their Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen fell upon the field. The defeat sent tremors through the Order's territories. But the Polish-Lithuanian alliance did not rest with its victory. They advanced straight toward Malbork, hoping to strike the final blow. As the enemy army drew near, Malbork made ready. Its walls stood tall, its stores were vast, and its defenders were resolved. The new Grand Master Heinrich von Plauen, a gifted strategist, took command. Siege engines were assembled, defences strengthened, and archers took their positions. For 2 months the Allied armies sought to break through Malbork's defences, but the castle held. Arrows poured down from the ramparts. Scalding oil streamed through the murder holes overhead. Sickness and dwindling provisions wore away at the men encamped outside. In time, the attackers gave up and pulled back. Battered as it was, the Order endured, at least for the moment. Yet Grunwald stood as the moment everything shifted. That sense of being untouchable had vanished. And even though Malbork's walls had held firm through the siege, the empire those walls protected had already started to fracture. Malbork Castle had come through the siege of 1410, but the Teutonic Order would never recover its former self. The crushing defeat at Grunwald had broken the myth of their supremacy. The tide that had once lifted their theocratic empire ever higher began, quietly, to fall away. Their lands were still enormous, their strongholds still unbreachable, and yet their hold on power was slipping, gradually at first and then rapidly. The Order buckled beneath debts, the costs of war, and unrest within its own borders. Needing money to defend itself and rebuild its forces, it laid heavy taxes on the people it ruled, above all on the swelling population of German-speaking merchants and townsfolk. But there were limits to what loyalty could bear. Resentment gathered across Prussia, stirred by economic strain and by the ever more high-handed conduct of the knights. In 1454 everything boiled over. A formidable alliance of Prussian nobles and cities, weary of the order's authority, turned to King Casimir IV of Poland and asked him to bring their lands under the Polish crown. The king consented, igniting the 13 Years' War, a brutal and grinding struggle that would settle the destiny of Malbork and the Teutonic state. In the beginning, the order stood firm. Malbork remained their prize, their fortress, but fortune had swung against them. The Polish army, supported by the rebellious Prussian League, drove deep into Teutonic land. No longer able to pay their hired soldiers, the knights blundered fatally. In 1457, staring at bankruptcy, the mercenaries garrisoning Malbork, mostly Bohemians, sold the castle to the Polish king, not with blades or siege engines but for silver. Poland passed through Malbork's gates not as a conqueror but as a purchaser. The mightiest fortress in Christendom had changed owners without a single clash of arms. The Teutonic knights fell back to Königsberg. Their state, while not wiped out completely, was broken and shamed. Malbork, once the command centre of a warlike order, was now a residence of the Polish crown. From then on, it would house kings rather than crusaders. The loss of Malbork sealed the ruin of the order's imperial ambitions. Their fortress had held against catapults, sieges, and swords, but in the end it was undone by money and betrayal. The era of the warrior monks had ended, and the brick walls that once carried prayers and battle plans now murmured only of decline. With the collapse of the Teutonic Knights in 1457, Malbork Castle passed into a new chapter, no longer the seat of crusading monks, but a jewel set in the Polish crown. King Casimir IV Jagiellon, who had gained the fortress by paying for it rather than fighting for it, saw Malbork as both a military prize and a powerful emblem of Poland, rising as the order declined. Malbork became one of the residences of the Polish kings, prized for its scale, its position, and its magnificence. Though it had been raised for defence and monastic austerity, its design suited courtly life better than anyone might have expected. The plain halls of the knights were warmed with tapestries and banners. Splendid receptions and diplomatic meetings took the place of chapter assemblies and war councils. The castle was folded into the royal Prussian territories, which governed themselves in part, yet remained faithful to the Polish crown. This set Malbork at the centre of a region rich in cultures and commerce. Its administrative work changed to match. Where armies had gathered, treasuries now grew, and its watchtowers kept an eye on trade routes rather than paths of war. Under Polish rule, Malbork was selectively renovated. Fresh wings appeared, and defences were reworked to answer the shifting nature of warfare, especially the growing menace of gunpowder. Platforms for cannon and bastions were woven into the older Gothic fabric, joining medieval design to Renaissance practicality. Yet for all its standing, Malbork's life as a royal residence was seasonal and ceremonial. The Polish kings kept their main court in Krakow or Warsaw, coming to Malbork now and then to manage matters in Prussia or to receive visiting dignitaries. The castle turned into a symbol of unity and victory, a reminder of Poland's win over the order and its widening reach across the Baltic. For all that its military weight had lessened, Malbork stayed a vital bulwark guarding northern Poland. It was garrisoned, kept up, and respected, but it was feared no longer. The fortress had exchanged monastic discipline for courtly ritual, its martial purpose for political prestige. Still, beneath the banners and fine cloth, the thick walls and deep moats remained, silent, lasting, and waiting. Kings had arrived, yet the castle's peaceful days would not go on forever. By the opening of the 17th century, Malbork Castle again found itself swept into the currents of war, this time not as a token of rising strength, but as a coveted piece on the geopolitical board of Northern Europe. The Swedish-Polish Wars, one thread in a larger contest for command of the Baltic Sea, would put the fortress to the test. A resurgent Sweden, under the ambitious kings Gustavus Adolphus and later Charles X Gustav, sought to master the Baltic coast, the so-called Dominium Maris Baltici. Poland, with its far-flung but loosely bound Commonwealth, stood in its path. The wars between the two were long and bitter, driven by religious rifts, dynastic rivalry, and the scramble for regional mastery. In 1626, the Swedes marched into Royal Prussia. Their disciplined, modernized army advanced swiftly, seizing important cities and ports. Malbork, with its heavy walls and its place along the Nogat River, became a prime target. Fortified though it was, the castle was no longer the unbreakable bastion of the Teutonic Age. Cannon fire, by now stronger and more accurate than ever, could hammer through even the stoutest Gothic walls. In 1656, during the calamitous stretch Poles remember as the deluge, Malbork at last fell. Swedish soldiers entered the fortress this time not as besiegers, but by way of surrender. Undermanned and short of supplies, the castle could not hold out against a drawn-out assault. Once more Malbork changed hands with no great battle, though the blow was no lighter for it. Under Swedish occupation, the castle was plundered and partly wrecked. Priceless objects, treasures, and archives were hauled off to Stockholm. The halls that had once hosted diplomacy and faith rang instead with foreign boots. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this loss was not merely a matter of ground. It cut deeply as a symbol. Malbork had stood for 2 centuries as a triumph of Polish power. Now it was one more wound in a nation under siege. The Swedes kept the castle several years until Poland won it back as part of a recovery that came slowly and at great cost. But the harm was already done. Malbork was now a fortress marked by occupation, its life as a royal seat dimming, its scars plain in broken walls and empty chapels. War had come again, and Malbork had ridden out the storm, but not without injury. By the 18th century, Malbork Castle, once the pulsing heart of a military monastic state and later a proud emblem of Polish kingship, had drifted into quiet obscurity. The political order around it was coming apart. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, hollowed by internal quarrels and foreign meddling, met its final partition in 1795 and vanished altogether from the map. Malbork, like much of the surrounding land, was swallowed by the growing Kingdom of Prussia. Under Prussian rule, the castle's strategic value had nearly evaporated. Gunpowder warfare had left medieval fortresses largely useless. Malbork was no longer a royal seat, no longer a token of conquest. It was an immense aging pile too costly to keep up and too unwieldy to modernize. The Prussian authorities put its vast halls and hollow chambers to plain, everyday purposes. The chapel, where Teutonic knights had once knelt in prayer, became a storehouse. The refectories were turned into barracks. Even portions of the ornate interiors were stripped out to make space for storage and military stores. Some structures were taken apart altogether, their bricks carried off for other buildings nearby. The castle was handled less as a historic monument than as a handy heap of usable material. Townsfolk and soldiers alike began to lose the memory of what it had been. Centuries of religious, political, and military legacy lay buried under dust and indifference. Visitors remarked on its crumbling towers, its fallen arches, and its ivy-clad walls. The once proud fortress was now little more than a husk of faded splendor, a relic too vast to overlook, yet too costly to restore. But even in decay, Malbork never wholly vanished. Travellers from Germany and farther afield still came now and then to marvel at its size, sketch its outline, and wonder at its forgotten grandeur. Artists and thinkers of the Romantic era, captivated by medieval ruins and tales of chivalry, began to see the castle not as outdated but as timeless, a frozen echo of a more heroic age. Even so, it stayed largely neglected, no longer defended, no longer ruled, no longer celebrated. Malbork stood in silence. The walls that had once resounded with battle cries, processions, and royal decrees now held only dust, shadows, and memories. It would take a new century, a rising fascination with national identity, and a wave of historical romanticism to breathe life back into its weathered bricks. In the 19th century, Malbork Castle's long silence was at last broken. As nationalism spread through Europe, so too did a fresh reverence for the medieval past. Ruins became relics. Forgotten fortresses became touchstones of cultural pride. For the Germans, now searching for a unified identity, Malbork, or Marienburg, as they called it, arose as a symbol of Teutonic strength and romanticized knighthood. The restoration got underway in earnest in the early 1800s, led by Prussian architects and historians who saw in the crumbling brick not merely a structure, but a story. Careful studies were made. Gothic motifs were thoughtfully reimagined. Sections were rebuilt with painstaking devotion to medieval styles, though often with a dash of 19th century artistic license. The work was not always historically exact. Some elements were idealized rather than authentic, yet the spirit of revival ran strong. Malbork became a national monument of the German Empire. Paintings, operas, and school books portrayed it as a cradle of Teutonic glory. German emperors came to visit, and ceremonies were held in its great halls. It was no longer merely a castle. It was heritage, myth, and architecture melded into one commanding icon. But the tides of history would turn yet again. After the First World War, the region was disputed. After the Second World War, it was transformed. In 1945, as Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia, Malbork endured heavy bombardment. Fires gutted the interiors and walls came down. Once more the castle stood in the midst of war, and once more it was left in ruins. After the war, Malbork became part of a reborn Poland, and its identity shifted yet again. No longer a badge of German pride, it became a reclaimed piece of Polish history, kept not for conquest, but for preservation. The post-war Polish government took on another vast restoration, this time striving for historical accuracy and cultural inclusiveness. Brick by brick it was raised again, not as a fortress of war, but as a monument to endurance. Today, Malbork Castle stands as the largest brick fortress in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a witness to nearly 8 centuries of European history. Tourists roam its courtyards. Historians study its layers. Its walls, once stained by siege and politics, now echo with the voices of schoolchildren and the quiet awe of visitors. Malbork no longer defends. It remembers. In the early 1800s, the United States was a young country brimming with restless ambition. Its eastern cities were swelling. But for many Americans, the true promise lay past the Appalachian Mountains, out in the vast, untamed wilderness of the West. This hunger to expand was more than a private urge. It was bound up in a national philosophy known as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were fated by providence or purpose to settle from the Atlantic to the Pacific, no matter what or who stood in their way. What began as a handful of daring homesteaders quickly grew into a great tide of movement. Traveling by wagon, on horseback and on foot, thousands of families pushed into the frontier, lured by the promise of inexpensive land, a fresh start, and a way out of debt, hardship, or crowded cities. Land grants, homesteading statutes, and enthusiastic newspaper columns spoke of rich soil, liberty, and property, all there for anyone bold enough to claim it. Yet the road westward tested the strong. Settlers endured weeks, sometimes months, of exhausting travel. Routes such as the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the California Trail stretched like veins across mountains, rivers, and open plains. Belongings were packed snugly into wagons that doubled as both vehicles and shelter. Peril waited at every turn. A river ford, an animal encounter, a shattered axle, or a sudden sickness could arrive with no warning. Even so, the draw of the West could not be resisted. For countless people, claiming a corner of the frontier meant far more than acquiring acreage. It was a chance to begin again. A struggling tenant farmer might become a property owner. An immigrant with nothing to inherit could build a life from scratch. Out on the frontier, there was no one to impress and no ruling class to appease, only untouched land and the resolve to master it. The frontier was equally a place of contradiction. It offered freedom, yet that freedom came through pushing aside indigenous peoples, whose homelands were relabeled as empty wilderness. It held out opportunity, but only to those tough or lucky enough to endure. Still, the legend of the frontier, of hardy individuals facing the unknown, became threaded into the American sense of self. And for those earliest settlers, frontier life was no mere daydream. It was a wager placed 1 mile, 1 river, and 1 wooden wheel at a time. Once the trek west was finished, if it was finished at all, the true labour was only beginning. The American frontier did not greet arrivals with finished houses or sown fields. It gave them only trees, earth, weather, and time. To build a homestead meant reshaping raw wilderness into ground that could support a family, and it started with the simplest need of all, shelter. The log cabin became the standard dwelling, chosen for its practicality rather than any comfort. Timber was plentiful and tools were scarce. A family might reach its plot carrying little beyond an axe, a wagon of provisions, and stubborn resolve. First they cleared the ground. Then they notched and stacked the logs, joining them without a single nail, sealing the gaps with mud and moss. Roofs were commonly formed from split logs or bundled grass. Windows counted as rare luxuries, and when they existed at all, they were small and usually covered with greased paper rather than glass. Within, life was severe but full of purpose. A single-room cabin might shelter an entire family, sometimes a dozen souls or more, all beneath one roof. Privacy barely existed. Meals were cooked over an open hearth, and smoke often drifted through the tight quarters. Bedding could be nothing more than straw packed into cloth sacks. Furniture was rough and handmade. Every object had a use. There was no space for ornament, only for getting by. Yet even under such conditions, a life slowly took form. Gardens were sown, small animals were kept. Children collected firewood and carried water from nearby streams. Women cooked, put up food, spun thread, and nursed the sick. Men hunted, trapped, raised fences, and guarded the homestead when the need arose. Each season demanded fresh toil, planting, reaping, splitting wood, laying up food for winter. Rest came seldom. Neighbors were scattered and distant, but where they existed, they were beyond price. Frontier families often labored together, raising barns side by side, aiding one another through childbirth or joining for the seasonal harvest. Survival rested not on independence alone, but on a delicate network of shared help. On the American frontier, nature acted as both giver and foe. Though the land promised plenty, it surrendered nothing for free. Every meal, every warm fire, every cup of clean water had to be won through sweat, skill, and stamina. There were no shops, no electricity, no filled pantries, only what could be grown, gathered, hunted, or stored away. Food weighed on the mind daily, never a mere convenience. In the first months after arriving, many families leaned on hardtack, salted pork, dried beans, and flour hauled from the east. Vital as they were, such stores ran low fast. The lasting answer was self-reliance. Gardens went in the moment the soil thawed. Corn, beans, squash, and potatoes formed the backbone of the diet. Herbs were raised for seasoning and for medicine alike. Nothing was thrown away. One ruined harvest could bring hunger or something worse. Meat was drawn from the wild. Men and older boys hunted deer, rabbits, and wild turkeys, and now and then larger game such as bison. Snares were laid for smaller creatures. Fishing in the nearby creeks supplied precious protein, especially in the warmer months. Every kill was a triumph, every good foraging trip a small win against uncertainty. But nature's bounty carried its hazards. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions prowled the same country, and in a poor season starvation was never far behind. Putting away food for winter was a craft that separated comfort from ruin. Smokehouses, root cellars, and drying racks kept meat, vegetables, and fruit fit to eat through the cold. Women simmered jars of jam, cured pork with salt, and pickled whatever would fit inside a barrel. Firewood stood stacked high by autumn. The hearth was the heart of warmth, cooking, and life itself. Weather stayed unpredictable and frequently merciless. Driving rains could drown the crops. Blizzards could cut families off for weeks. Droughts crumbled gardens into dust. Lightning set cabins ablaze. Tornadoes leveled them. Sickness spread quickly when water froze or turned foul. No safety net existed, only preparation, luck, and endurance. Although frontier life is often pictured as lonely and rugged, few pioneers lived in genuine isolation. Survival might start with a lone cabin, but in time, scattered homesteads knit into something larger, communities held together by need, trust, and the common task of taming the land. Neighbors, however far apart, were lifelines. With no formal institutions in place, frontier families depended on each other. Barn raisings, harvests, log rollings, and quilting bees were more than work. They were gatherings. A dozen men could put up a building in a day. Women prepared the food, minded the children, and passed along news from miles off. Such occasions forged bonds stronger than any fence. They turned survival into a joint effort. Lacking newspapers, telegraphs, or town criers, news moved by word of mouth. A passing trader or a caller from a nearby settlement might carry stories from hundreds of miles away, of shifting politics, whispers of war, sightings of native tribes, or word of a bitter winter on the way. Such reports travelled cabin to cabin like a spreading flame. When a family received a letter, it was often read aloud again and again for friends and neighbours, becoming a shared glimpse of the world beyond. Religion drew people together as well. Traveling preachers, known as circuit riders, followed long routes to deliver sermons in cabins, barns, or open fields. Families walked for hours simply to reach a Sunday service, turning it into a full day of prayer, song, and fellowship. Faith offered comfort and moral order in a land where law was still finding its footing. Schooling was scarce but treasured. When enough children lived close by, families might join forces to raise a one-room schoolhouse. A young woman or an older child might teach from a Bible, a slate, and whatever handful of books could be found. Gatherings like spelling bees and holiday celebrations brought rare delight and a taste of normal life amid the hardship. Frontier life was not only a contest with nature, it was also a meeting of peoples, cultures, and rival claims to the land. As settlers moved west, they crossed into territories long held by Native American tribes. To the pioneers, the land was a promise. To indigenous peoples, it was home. What followed was a strained, often violent balance between conflict and coexistence. Some meetings were peaceful. Trade was common along the major trails. Settlers swapped metal tools, cloth, or firearms for furs, food, and local knowledge. Native guides at times helped families find their way through unknown country or warned them of coming storms. There were genuine moments of friendship, shared meals, exchanged gifts, and quiet understanding across the cultural gap. But those moments were fragile, and the weight of expansion would stretch them until they snapped. As more homesteads sprang up, so did friction over land and resources. Settlers cleared forests, redirected streams, and hunted the game, unaware of, or indifferent to, how deeply these lands were bound to the spiritual, economic, and ancestral life of native nations. Treaties were signed, then broken. Promises were made, then set aside. Hostility grew as a result. Raids happened on both sides. Some settlers dreaded attacks in the night. Homes were fortified. Rifles were kept within reach. Children were taught to stay silent and out of sight. Tales of violence, whether true or overblown, spread fast and fed the fear. Meanwhile, indigenous communities watched their lands shrink, their hunting grounds disappear, and their way of life endangered by strange laws and permanent fences. Militias took shape, forts went up, whole conflicts broke out. From minor skirmishes to full wars like the Black Hawk War or the clashes along the Oregon Trail, some tribes chose to fight. Others turned to diplomacy or withdrew farther west, only to meet still more settlers in time. There was no tidy ending. And yet, even through the conflict, moments of cooperation held on. Some Native Americans worked beside settlers, married into their families, or embraced Christianity. Some settlers took up indigenous farming methods, herbal remedies, or techniques for surviving the winter. The frontier was a land of blurred lines, not always war, not always peace. On the American frontier, survival was often credited to grit, strength, and resilience, and no one carried those qualities more quietly or completely than the women of the wilderness. Frontier stories tend to shine their light on men blazing trails or holding off wolves, yet it was the labor, cleverness, and endurance of women that kept frontier life from falling apart. Day after punishing day, women filled many roles, frequently all at the same time. They were mothers, healers, teachers, farmers, hunters, and protectors, expected to work from first light until well past dark. A pioneer wife might open her day by lighting the fire, milking the cow, and making breakfast. From there she churned butter, mended clothing, watched the children, gathered herbs, and kept up the garden. In a crisis, she delivered babies, dressed wounds, and sat beside the dying, with no formal training and often no one to help. Yet women were not bound to the home. Many worked the fields alongside their husbands, split wood, all into hand-raising cabins. Some hunted small game. Others drove the wagons during the westward journey, handling oxen and picking a path through rough country when the men were hurt or away. When widowed, which happened often enough, they carried entire homesteads alone, raising children and crops on little more than raw will. Women also carried culture, learning, and continuity. In remote places with no schools, they taught their children to read and write from family Bibles and borrowed books. They kept diaries, wrote letters, and set down recipes and remedies, records that would later become rich historical sources. Through them, we glimpse the human side of the frontier, the yearning for company, the fight against loneliness, the quiet pride in a well-baked loaf or a warm quilt. They also formed the spiritual and emotional center of many frontier communities. Women arranged prayer meetings, holiday gatherings, and networks of mutual aid. When a neighbor fell ill, they carried broth and comfort. When a child died, they dug the graves and grieved together. Their strength was not always loud, but it was ever present, steady as the fire on the hearth. For children on the American frontier, life was measured not by toys or school books, but by responsibility, resilience, and resourcefulness. From their earliest years, frontier boys and girls were counted on to help the family endure. Childhood was short and frequently harsh, shaped by heavy labor, long winters, and the constant demands of a wild and shifting land. Daily existence for children on the frontier was shaped by labor rather than leisure. Boys learned to split firewood, hunt small game, look after the animals, and stand guard over the family homestead. Girls lent their hands to cooking, spinning, milking the cows, working the garden, and minding their younger brothers and sisters. Even a child of 5 carried responsibilities that had to be finished before the morning meal. When every worker counted, there was scarcely a moment to be spared for doing nothing. Even so, growing up on the frontier was not without its pleasures. Children made room for play with whatever lay at hand. A rag doll stitched together at home, a small animal whittled from wood, or a simple hoop rolled along with a stick. They dreamed up games out of pebbles, twigs, and their own imaginations, frequently borrowing from the tales handed down beside the fireside. Occasions such as harvest time or a barn dance provided uncommon moments of enjoyment and a chance to mingle with other youngsters, some of whom lived many miles distant. Schooling was something granted to a fortunate few, not something everyone received. Across many areas, no schools stood at all. Where one could be found, it was usually a single-room cabin in which one teacher taught pupils of every age together. Lessons ran brief, and the school calendar tended to bend around the times of planting and gathering the crops. Books were scarce, and paper scarcer still. Youngsters learned by speaking words aloud, marking their slates, and committing verses to memory, many of them drawn from the Bible. For all its difficulties, life on the frontier planted lasting qualities in the young that they would carry through their grown years. A reliance on oneself, a steadiness of habit, careful thrift, and plain toughness. They came to tend livestock, prepare meals, and mend broken tools, not as a pastime, but because their lives leaned on it. They saw birth and death, and the raw force of nature, close at hand, often with no shelter from it and no words of explanation. Such moments gave them a seriousness well beyond their years. Winter on the American frontier was no fleeting stretch of the calendar. It measured everything a household had made ready. Once the first snowfall arrived, the whole land was altered. Paths disappeared, rivers turned to ice, the trees stood stripped and bare, and the wind bit through even the heaviest wool. For weeks, sometimes months on end, the isolation grew complete, and staying alive rested wholly on the work done before the chill set in. Cabins were shored up. Gaps in the walls were packed tight with moss, clay, or scraps of cloth. Firewood was piled high, cord upon cord, since once the snow lay deep, a trip outside for more could bring frostbite or something worse. The hearth turned into the very centre of the home. Its flames burned through the day and the night, warming the walls, cooking the meals, and lending a thin thread of ordinary life against the cold. Keeping food from spoiling was a matter of survival. A family that had not salted enough meat, dried enough vegetables, or set aside enough grain often faced hunger. Root cellars were dug down deep, lined with straw, and filled with potatoes, onions, and jars of what had been put up. Meals were plain but filling. Stews, cornbread, dried fruit, and beans all stretched to feed as far as they could. Yet, apart from cold and empty stomachs, solitude carried a threat of its own. Whole weeks could slip by without the sight of another face. Banks of snow made any journey nearly hopeless. Letters from the eastern states came late, when they came at all. The stillness of the woods ran deep. For certain people, women and children in particular, the loneliness grew hard to bear. Cabin fever, worry, and low spirits were widespread, though seldom put into words. Households filled the hours with what they had, telling stories, reading scripture, mending garments, whittling tools, or stitching worn quilts. Children played softly indoors, teaching themselves to pass the time in little space and with few diversions. Each day was counted out by the fire's light and by what still remained in the cellar. Even in the harshest cold, though, patience quietly took hold. Winter was a season of waiting, for the sun to climb a little sooner, for the snow to give way, for the ground to grow soft once more beneath weary boots. And when spring at last returned, with its thawing creeks and homecoming birds, frontier families stepped out of their cabins, leaner but living. As the 19th century drew toward its close, the American frontier had started to slip away. Rail lines sliced across the plains. Towns sprang up where nothing but forest had stood, and the sweeping wilderness was carved up by fences and property deeds. But what the frontier left behind, its ways, its beliefs, and its legends, lingered long after the final wagon wheel groaned toward the west. In 1890, the United States Census made its well-known announcement that the frontier had closed. The land had been settled, charted, and spoken for. Homesteads turned into farms, cabins into towns, and territories into states. What had been a perilous and uncertain rim of civilization now belonged to the heart of the country. And still, the tale of the frontier stayed woven deep into the American sense of self, moulded by the very people who had lived through it. Those who settled the frontier handed down far more than log cabins and split-rail fences. They passed on a national temperament grounded in self-reliance, persistence, and invention. The notion that a person might shape a life with nothing but their own two hands took its place at the core of the American dream. The frontier ideal cast hard labor, personal liberty, and rugged independence in a glowing light, values that still ring through today's culture, its politics, and its folklore. Yet this inheritance was not simple. The same westward push that opened doors for settlers exacted a ruinous price from native peoples. Tribes were driven from their lands, treaties were broken, and whole cultures were unsettled or wiped away. The land itself was changed for good. Forests were cleared, rivers turned from their courses, and wildlife hunted nearly out of existence. The frontier's triumph arrived hand in hand with losses that could never be undone. Even so, the stories lived on. Frontier journals, spoken histories, and family lore kept the spirit of those early days from fading. Pioneers grew into legends. Men such as Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. Women such as Laura Ingalls Wilder, standing for bravery and staying power. Their lives were reshaped into books, into songs, and in time into films. The truth was frequently grimmer than the legend, yet the myth held a meaning of its own. Even now, traces of the frontier remain. Weathered cabins, the ruts worn by wagon wheels, and headstones carved by hand. Museums and historic sites keep the old objects safe, but the deepest legacy rests in the lasting sense of possibility the frontier awakened. The conviction that anyone, whatever their beginnings, could begin again, weather hardship, and leave something lasting behind.